All right, guys, in chapter 6, we're going to be looking at bone tissue and bone physiology. And we're going to start looking at some of the functions of the skeletal system. And so in this slide, you see 6 of the main types of functions that you'll find for the skeletal system, including number 1, protection. That's probably one of the most critical parts of the skeletal system, but it's not the only one. Think about how the bones protect the body and the organs, such as the skull that surrounds the brain, and then your chest cavity having the ribs and things, the sternum, and vertebrae protecting your spinal cord. But number 2, the skeletal system also serves as a site for mineral storage. Mainly calcium and phosphorus are stored in a particular type of mineral. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then that mineral gets released as needed. And so you need a certain amount of calcium and a certain amount of phosphorus or phosphate in your blood. And so you store this calcium and phosphate in the bone matrix and then release it whenever it's needed. The bones are also the site of blood cell production, and so you have what's called red bone marrow that's located inside of your bones, and that's where you find the stem cells or the starting type cells for blood cell production. It's also a location, the bones are also a location for storing some fat, some adipose tissue in some of that area where the bone marrow is located. And then, of course, movement. That's because you have muscles, skeletal muscles that are attached to the bones that allow for movement. And then support. You have some parts of the skeleton, and then also the cartilage that is there for support, such as cartilage that's found in the nose and in the ear. And there's also cartilage associated with the rib cage area. There's cartilage there. And you have cartilage that's associated with the trachea that helps to support the windpipe area. And then also your ligaments. These help to bind bones to bones, and that helps to support the skeleton. So some of the main components of the skeletal system that we'll look at in this chapter, of course, would be the bones. Now, there's a separate chapter that we'll be looking at in lab that deals with the anatomy of the skeleton, actually naming the bones. And so this particular chapter is really looking at the function or the physiology of the skeletal system. We'll also look at some cartilage. There's 3 main types of cartilage: hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. And then we'll also be looking at tendons and ligaments. So let's first of all look at some of the main structures of a bone. And you see a picture here of a section of a long bone. It basically is covered with a double layer of connective tissue on the outside, and that's called the periosteum. By the way, anytime you see this root word here, osteo or osteum, that's going to refer to something associated with the bone. In this case, peri, on the prefix here, peri, is referring to around, and so you have a membrane or connective tissue membrane that covers the outside. It's a very fibrous layer on the outer portion, and then you find cellular portion on the inner side. In other words, it has individual cells and cells that are cell types that make up this inner layer of the periosteum on the inside. And so some special cells that we'll talk about: osteoblast, osteoclast, and then something called an osteochondral progenitor cell. The perforating fibers, or sometimes referred to as Sharpie fibers, these are collagen fibers that help to connect your tendons. Your tendons are connective tissue that help to bind the muscles to the bones, and then ligaments help to connect bones to bones. And so perforating fibers help to connect these types of connective tissues to the periosteum. And then you have another layer, membrane layer, called an endosteum. Endo refers to inside of. And so inside of a long bone, around this hollow cavity here, or this open cavity, you have a layer of membrane called the endosteum here. Now, let's talk about the bone matrix. The bone matrix could be compared to something like reinforced concrete. In other words, it has a organic portion that is made from protein fibers, collagen, protein fibers, and other chemicals called proteoglycans. That's part of the matrix portion there. It also has an inorganic that helps to strengthen the bone And that's your calcium and phosphorus or calcium phosphate crystals we mentioned earlier that you're storing inside of the bone. But that's a mineral form called hydroxyapatite. And so in the little picture here, you can kind of see a normal type of bone here. But if you remove this mineral portion, then it takes away a lot of the strength of the bone, and the bone just becomes too easily bent, too bendable. The collagen portion, though, gives it some strength and integrity as well. And so if you don't have the collagen portion, then the big bone becomes too mineralized and it becomes too brittle. So let's talk about some of those cells that we find in that cellular layer. The first one is an osteoblast. And so again, you see that prefix osteo referring to the bone. Blast refers to building up. And so an osteoblast is what's building the bone. It's what's building the bone matrix. And that process, which we'll talk about a little later in the chapter, is called ossification. The process to build bone is called ossification. And so these osteoblasts have the ability to make and to build collagen fibers. Some chemicals we'll talk about a little later called proteoglycans, and that mineral form, the hydroxyapatite, the calcium and the phosphate crystals. Now, ossification, the process of bone formation, can occurs which is called an appositional type of growth that occurs on the existing bone or cartilage. The osteocytes, this is another type of bone cell that you would find inside of your bones. And so these are your mature type of bone cells. They are surrounded by the matrix. A lot of times they're referred to as stellate just because they have the appearance of like star-like appearance. And so in the little diagram here, you have a fully developed bone cell, an osteocyte. It kind of has a star appearance, and it's surrounded in the little openings here by the bone matrix. So that's going to include the proteoglycan, the collagen fibers, and the calcium phosphate crystals. Now, the function of your osteocyte is to kind of maintain, it forms a structure of the bones, but also helps to maintain the matrix. It does produce a little bit of that matrix to kind of help repair and maintain that matrix, but really that's making the matrix is really the function of your osteoblast. Then a couple other vocab words here for you: lacunae and caniculi. The lacunae are spaces where you find, you're going to find an osteocyte kind of surrounded by a little opening or a space, and that's going to be the lacuna. That's singular, like you have one bone cell here in this picture, an osteocyte, and you've got some space around it. That's a little protective space there that this cell resides in. And then lacunae, that's plural. And then the canaliculi are canals, little small tunnels that allow for these cells to kind of connect to each other. The osteocytes actually connect to each other and can communicate through these connections with each other. And so they have to have some type of little small canal that allows the cell extension to connect from one cell to the next. Now, the third type of cell here is the osteoclast. You have osteoblast, osteocytes, and I have osteoclasts. And the clast portion here means it breaks down. And so an osteoclast is a cell that actually has the ability to break down that bone matrix. And so that's called reabsorption because those chemicals, the calcium and the phosphate minerals, they get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream whenever the osteoclasts work. And so these cells actually have enzymes and acids that release hydrogen ions are associated with acid. And so they release enzymes and kind of an acidic environment that helps to break down the bone matrix whenever the body needs more calcium and more phosphate in the bloodstream. It's going to allow these osteoclasts to kind of speed up and break down some of that bone matrix to get those ions back into the bloodstream. Now, there's two main types of bone, spongy bone and compact bone, and they are kind of look like what they sound like. Spongy bone looks very spongy because it has a lot of what are called interconnecting rods or trabeculae. I'll show you that in a minute. The trabeculae help function as a scaffolding type system where it helps to strengthen the ends of the bones. Compact bone is very dense type bone, but it doesn't have that same type of connecting rod, so you don't have a lot of space there, but it's very dense type bone, usually on the sides of a long bone. So here again is a couple terms associated with the spongy bone. The trabeculae I mentioned, that's your interconnecting rods. This is what it kind of looks like. They kind of drew a little diagram of it. It looks like a scaffolding system, so it's very strong, but it has a lot of space there that would be filled up with bone marrow and then blood vessels, because remember, you have living tissue, living cells inside of the bones, and so you have to have access to the nutrients and blood supply. So you have these spaces for the blood vessels to go through, and then the bone marrow would be here as well. The compact bone, there's a couple of vocabulary words here for compact bone. We'll see some of these in lab as well. The central unit, or the main unit of compact bone, is this little circular region. You kind of see this on the tissue here. You can kind of see these little circular regions on the diagram. These are called osteons. This is a central unit of a compact bone. That osteon has a canal right in the middle called a central canal. That's where you're going to find a blood vessels running through the central canal. They're also referred to as Haversian canals, but most of the time they're just called central canals. Then they have bone matrix laid down in different formats called lamellae. Lamellae is a word meaning layers, and so some of the bone matrix is laid down in concentric circles going around the central canal. So you see concentric layers. You see some lamellae that's kind of going around the entire bone structure. So that's circumferential lamellae that's going around the circumference. And then you see some lamellae, some bone matrix area right around the what's called the interstitial area outside of these osteons. And so that osteon, again, is these little circular regions that kind of look like tree rings. That's composed of the central canal, the different bone cells that are part of that, and then the concentric lamellae, and then the osteocytes are there as well. One other thing you'll see with compact bone are other canals. These are called perforating canals because they perforate through the bone tissue. And again, these have blood vessels associated with it, and they usually connect to osteons. So here you have, like, you can kind of see a side view of an osteon going down. Here's your central canal going down, and then another neighboring osteon with a central canal and a vessel going down for it. And then you have a perforating canal that allows for blood vessels to move side by side inside of the bone matrix.